Romans 2:15, this is the great apostle Paul, writing to the Christian church in Rome, Italy. He says, God's laws are written within them. That means the Gentiles, their own conscience accuses them and sometimes excuses them. Now, he's contrasting the Jewish people who had the Bible. Okay? The Jewish people had the Bible. The non-Jewish people, they didn't have the Bible. So how are they going to know about God? Well, because Paul tells you here, not only because of the what? The universe, but what else does he tell you here? God's laws are written within them. Their own conscience accuses them and excuses them. In other words, people know by nature that there is a God. And we're going to talk about that next week. Some of you may already know this. Remember how God created Adam and Eve in his own image? Okay. That implies, that doesn't mean physical, by the way. I'll reiterate that next week. It has nothing to do with physical. It's spiritual. Okay? Adam and Eve knew God. Now, you know what the word knew meant. They knew God perfectly. Okay? Then they're going to fall into sin next week, which we're going to look at. But there is a residue left over of that image. People know there's a God, and it's called conscience. Okay? Conscience. Every human being of every civilization in every time and place has conscience, even if they didn't have the Bible. Because God put it there. In other words, God made human beings as moral creatures, knowing God. And that's why he says the conscience of these people either accuses them, I shouldn't have done that. You remember that little voice? I remember the first time I was aware of that little voice as a kid. Ooh, where'd that come from? That was inside. Yeah. Either accuses them, makes them feel what? Guilty, or sometimes excuses them. In other words, the conscience can say, oh yeah, well, he had it coming. I'm glad I did it. So every human being knows. Now let me tell you the most profound illustration that I've ever heard that human beings know in the conscience that there is a God. Most of you here have heard of Helen Keller? Okay. Remember, she wasn't born blind and deaf, but within 6 months, okay, she was totally blind, right? And deaf, and she couldn't speak. And she was kind of, you know, this very famous story. She was a very wild child. Well, why? Because there was no way to communicate with her. She was kind of like a wild animal. Okay? And then finally, is it Mrs. Sullivan? Yeah, I always get mixed up with Campbell. And I think it was Mrs. Sullivan, wasn't it? She comes along and she starts to teach Helen Keller. And how does she teach her? She's blind. She can't hear. With hand signs, remember? Hand signs. And she develops an alphabet for Helen Keller. Well, this opens up a new whole world. She starts to calm down. Mrs. Sullivan, using this hand-signed alphabet, starts communicating with her, teaching her as a teacher. And then one day, because Mrs. Sullivan was a Christian, one day they get around to talking about God. And Helen Keller, after she hears for the very first time about God, in her hand sign, she hand signs back to Mrs. Sullivan and says, aha, I thought so. Did you get that? In other words, before it was ever said to her about a being called God, she already had the what? She already had the idea. Where'd that come from? Paul tells you in Romans 2. People by nature know there's a God. Now again, they don't know who this God is necessarily. Okay? And they don't know, does this God like me? That's where we're going to get to Jesus, because in Jesus we not only know this one true God, but we know what? He likes me. How do we know He likes me? Because He died on the cross for me. Okay? But you don't have to be a Christian to know there's a God, because you got the universe and conscience.